Sometimes the person who is hurting the most is the person saying the least. They don't argue. They don't demand an explanation. They don't send a long message explaining how badly you hurt them. They simply become quiet. And from the outside, that silence can look like indifference. Maybe they don't care. Maybe they're being cold. Maybe they've moved on. But sometimes silence isn't the absence of emotion. Sometimes it's what happens when emotion becomes too complicated to express. Think about someone who normally talks to you every day. They joke with you, share small details, tell you what's bothering them. Then one day, something happens. You say something that cuts deeper than you realize, or they feel ignored, betrayed, embarrassed, or disappointed, and suddenly they're different. Their replies become shorter. They stop explaining themselves. They stop asking questions. When you say, "What's wrong?" they say, "Nothing." But there is clearly something. So why do some people become silent when they're hurt instead of speaking about it? One reason is emotional overload. When people experience intense emotions, their ability to organize those emotions into clear language can become more difficult. They may know they're hurt without knowing exactly what they need to say about it. Imagine someone sitting alone after an argument, replaying the conversation over and over. "I shouldn't have said that. Why did they treat me like that? Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I should just let it go." The problem isn't that they have nothing to say. The problem is that they have too much happening internally, and silence becomes a temporary way of creating psychological space. This is where emotional regulation becomes important. Emotional regulation doesn't mean never feeling angry, sad, disappointed, or rejected. It means managing those emotions well enough that they don't completely control your behavior. For some people, stepping away and becoming quiet is actually an attempt to regulate themselves. They know that if they speak while they're overwhelmed, they might say something they don't mean. So they choose silence. Not necessarily because they want to punish you, sometimes because they don't trust themselves to speak without making the situation worse. But there is another side to this. Silence can also be learned. Maybe growing up, they discovered that expressing hurt didn't lead to comfort. Maybe when they cried, someone told them to stop being dramatic. Maybe when they complained, they were told they were too sensitive. Maybe whenever they tried to explain themselves, the conversation somehow became about why they were wrong. Over time, a person can learn something powerful. Talking about my feelings doesn't make things better. And once that belief becomes familiar, silence starts feeling safer than vulnerability. This is one reason two people can experience the exact same conflict and respond completely differently. One person thinks, "We need to talk about this." The other thinks, "Talking about this will only make me feel worse." Neither reaction automatically tells you who cares more. They may simply have learned different ways of protecting themselves. And sometimes, the quiet person isn't avoiding the conversation. They're avoiding the possibility of being misunderstood again. That's an important distinction. Because when someone has already explained their feelings several times and felt dismissed, repeating themselves can become emotionally exhausting. Imagine telling someone, "That really hurt me." And they respond, "You're taking it too seriously." So you explain again. They say, "You're too sensitive." You try again. They become defensive. Eventually, you stop explaining, not because the pain disappeared, because you stopped believing that explaining it would change anything. That is where silence can become a form of withdrawal. And withdrawal isn't always healthy. Sometimes it protects a person long enough to calm down. Other times, it creates distance that becomes harder and harder to repair. There is a subtle difference between healthy silence and emotional avoidance. Healthy silence says, "I need some time to understand what I'm feeling so I can talk about it properly." Emotional avoidance says, "I don't want to feel this, so I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist." The outside behavior can look almost identical. Both people may stop talking, but internally they're doing completely different things. One is processing, the other is escaping. And this becomes especially interesting in close relationships. Because when someone goes quiet, the other person often starts filling in the blanks. They must be angry. They don't love me anymore. They're trying to manipulate me. They've already moved on. This is where our minds can become unreliable. When information is missing, we naturally try to create a story that explains it. And the story isn't always accurate. A quiet person might be deeply hurt, or they might be thinking about whether the relationship is still emotionally safe, or they might be trying to decide whether the conflict was a one-time mistake or evidence of a larger pattern. Silence can sometimes be the visible part of a much larger internal evaluation. They're not just thinking about what happened, they're thinking about what it means. Can I trust this person? Do they actually understand me? Is this going to happen again? Am I asking for too much? Should I say something, or should I just let this go? And that last question can reveal something painful. People who frequently stay quiet when hurt can become extremely good at minimizing their own needs. They might say, "It's fine." They might forgive quickly. They might tell themselves they shouldn't be bothered. They might even convince themselves that being low maintenance makes them easier to love. But there is a psychological cost to constantly swallowing emotional experiences. Unexpressed hurt doesn't automatically disappear. Sometimes it becomes resentment. Sometimes it becomes emotional distance. Sometimes the person remains physically present while psychologically checking out of the relationship. And that's why the quietest person in the room isn't necessarily the most peaceful. They may simply be carrying the conversation entirely inside their own head. There's another misconception worth challenging. People often assume that someone who goes quiet doesn't know how to communicate. Sometimes that's true. But sometimes the opposite is true. They may be highly aware of what they're feeling. They may notice every change in someone's tone. They may remember exactly what was said. They may understand the emotional meaning behind a conversation better than they can explain it in the moment. Self-awareness and communication are not the same skill. You can understand yourself deeply and still struggle to communicate when you're emotionally overwhelmed. And sometimes the person who goes silent is waiting for something very simple, not a perfect apology, not a dramatic declaration, just evidence that someone noticed. "Hey, you seem different. Did I hurt you?" That question can feel completely different from, "Why are you acting like this?" The first communicates curiosity. The second can feel like accusation. And when someone already feels emotionally exposed, that difference matters. But if you're the person who goes quiet when you're hurt, there's something worth asking yourself. Is your silence giving you space to understand your feelings? Or are you hoping someone will notice your pain without you having to risk expressing it? Because those are very different things. If you need space, say that. "I'm hurt right now. I don't want to say something impulsively. I need some time, but I do want to talk about this." That isn't weakness, that's emotional responsibility. And if you're dealing with someone who has gone quiet, don't immediately force them to speak. But don't automatically assume they don't care either. Give them room while leaving the door open. Sometimes the safest thing you can say is, "I won't pressure you, but when you're ready, I'm willing to listen." Because people don't always become silent when they have nothing to say. Sometimes they become silent because what they have to say matters so much to them that they're afraid of what will happen once they finally say it. And maybe that's the part we misunderstand most about quiet people. Their silence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's emotion waiting for a place where it feels safe enough to become words. And the real question isn't always, "Why aren't they talking?" Sometimes it's, "What happened to make talking feel unsafe?"